Throughout history, many infectious, non-infectious diseases and illnesses have plagued the world. However, one sort of disease, viruses, has stood out from the rest. To combat this, Edward Jenner headed the creation of the first vaccine in 1798. Due to previous raging smallpox epidemics in the early to late 18th century, however, Edward Jenner had not anticipated that his invention would not only save millions upon millions of lives, but even de-escalate the high tensions between major forces in the world, possibly saving billions of lives upon that. The creation of the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner in 1798 created all the bridges necessary for easing tensions between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. The collaboration by Polish-American scientist Albert Sabin and Soviet scientist Mikhail Chumakov for the destruction of the polio virus, as well with the WHO's support under D.A. Henderson, broke barriers in medical diplomacy, uniting countless countries afterwards, which brought about the utter destruction of the smallpox virus. This was the first major conflict example of the usage of collaborative research across different borders for human health and diplomacy, setting an example for the rest of the world to follow. Smallpox was highly infectious with no known cure. It began as early as 1350 BCE with the evidence of Egyptian mummies. Smallpox has been believed to have arrived in the Americas in 1520 on Spanish ships sailing all the way from Cuba, which was carried by infected African slaves. Its victims would be left with blindness, disfigurement, and scars all over their body. Smallpox has been believed to have caused almost 300 to 500 million deaths worldwide. This caused countless attempts to prevent and cure smallpox. In Smallpox, its external treatment and prevention by William Belshaw, he states, "My method of treating smallpox is using a disinfectant wash made of 1 ounce of nitrate lead to 1 quart of water." His treatment was obviously completely lackluster of knowledge of how infectious diseases work, but it still portrayed the growing urge to find a real cure and treatment of smallpox. Ancient practices were used, most notably variolation, which was the practice of transferring small amounts of smallpox sores to healthy patients, resulting in milder forms of the illnesses. These practices were used as early as 200 BCE with varying viruses. According to the National Library of Medicine, Edward Jenner and the History of Smallpox and Vaccination, at age 13 he was apprenticed to a county surgeon and apothecary. Jenner heard a dairymaid say, "I shall never have smallpox, for I have had cowpox. I shall never had an ugly pock-marked face." In fact, it was a common belief that dairymaids were in some way protected from smallpox. With this correlation, Edward Jenner went on to work on producing the legendary smallpox vaccine. The Cold War, on another note, began after the surrender of Nazi Germany during 1945. This began as a result of 2 competing superpowers as well as their respective alliances. The Cold War was waged on political, economical, and massive amounts of propaganda. The tense wartime alliances between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union started to fall apart after Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, close to the end of World War II. Left-wing governments had been imposed by the Soviet Union in 1948 and the Eastern European nations that the Red Army had freed. The Soviet Union's enduring hegemony over Eastern Europe and the possibility of communist parties with the Soviet support gaining power in Western Europe's democracies were fears shared by the United States and the United Kingdom. Conversely, the Soviets were committed to preserving their hold on Eastern Europe as a means of protecting themselves against any potential resurgence of German aggression, and they aimed to propagate communism across the globe, mostly for ideological motives. By 1947 to 1948, the United States' aid to Western Europe through the Marshall Plan had placed those nations under American control, and the Soviet Union had established overtly communist regimes in Eastern Europe, solidifying the Cold War. However, while the Soviet Union and the US were threatening each other with nuclear weapons, a certain case of polio was ravaging the 2 nations. Polio, short of poliomyelitis, devastated the lives of millions, some getting their lungs incapacitated, leaving them in iron lungs to recover. Many lost functions in their limbs, and many more lost their lives. With this threat, scientists Albert B. Sabin, a Polish-American, and Jonas E. Salk, another American, building upon the scientific process that Edward Jenner discovered through his creation of the smallpox vaccine, developing the first experimental polio oral vaccine in 1955. In the Soviet Union following Stalin's death, Russian scientists Anatoly Shtromadov and Mikhail P. Chumkov went to work in developing a cure for the polio epidemic harming many in their country. Knowing that America was in the process of developing a cure, Chumkov and his wife Marina went to confer in Sabin on scientific discussions in 1956. Despite overall reluctance from both governments, both Mr. and Mrs. Chumkov would end up getting along with Sabin and develop a beneficial and productive relationship. Sabin, Chumkov, and Smordidon would challenge the complications of language barriers, distrust from personnel on both sides, and accusations directed towards their effort. Eventually, both scientists would refine the vaccine even further, and in 1959, Chumkov would convince the present Politburo member responsible for public health, Anastas Mikoyan, to grant permission for oral polio vaccine tests. Mikoyan was unhappy to hear about the collaboration, but he eventually granted Chumkov's request. Shortly after the approval, Chumkov tested the oral vaccine on 10 million school children throughout the Soviet Union. Quickly, within a few months, almost everyone under the age of 20, which was roughly 100 million people, received the vaccine through oral drops or candy. Not to mention the US was completely vaccinated as well. This collaboration was considered a success on both sides, resulting in each side coming out of the collaborative ordeal happy. A representative from the WHO would approve of the vaccine, ensuring that it was safe for consumption and had significant results. Ensuing vaccination campaigns headed by the WHO would happen in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, China, Philippines, and much more nearing the end of the 20th century. The example that the brave Soviet scientist Chumkov, Smordidon, Marina Voroshilova, and the American scientists Sabin and Salk had set for the whole world proved to be beneficial in the long run. Now the WHO, following the scientists' example, had global leaders from all over the world sign a parchment certifying the global eradication of smallpox. This phenomenon of joint development of a vaccine from opposing countries was termed vaccine diplomacy. And with the recent COVID-19 outbreak, global public health organizations hope to seize upon the crisis to advance international cooperative efforts to fight COVID-19. And the promise of advanced economies embracing vaccine diplomacy to get shots in their arms around the planet was a key element in the strategy. It is clearly evident with opposing nations at odds and wide-surging epidemics that all nations on this globe can drop our differences to protect what is the only thing that matters in an epidemic: our lives. Smallpox was an incredibly impactful disease that took the lives of many. Millions have perished at the hands of this, as well as millions of people's lives were destroyed. Two enemies who seemed to never put an end to their feud managed to help stop this horrible disease through their collaborative efforts for the polio vaccine. Diplomatic teamwork can make impacts that don't seem possible. To date, smallpox is believed to be the first disease completely eradicated. The creation of the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner in 1798 created all the bridges necessary for easing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The collaboration by Polish-American scientist Albert Sabin and Soviet scientist Mikhail Chumkov with the WHO's support under D.A. Henderson broke barriers in medical diplomacy and brought about the near global immunity to the polio and utter destruction of the smallpox virus. This was the first major conflict example of the usage of collaborative research across different borders for human health and diplomacy, setting an example for the rest of the world to follow.